Okay, welcome to Unit 4, Day 2. Today we're going to be learning about imaginary numbers, so numbers we've never seen before. And the building block of all these numbers is the square root of -1. I know in the past you've been told you cannot have a square root of -1, but today we're defining that. And we're saying let the square root of -1 equal I. So that's always a lowercase I. So the square root of -1 is I. So I is just equal to I. That's not very interesting. But if we have I squared, this is the same thing as saying the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which gives us -1 squared square root. And the square root and the squared cancel, so we're left with a -1. I cubed is the same thing as I squared times I. And we just defined I squared as -1. So we can replace the I squared with a -1 multiplied by I. So -1 times I is a negative I. Let's make sure that negative stands out. And finally, I to the 4th power is the same thing as I times I times I times I. Whenever we have I times I, that's -1. That equals -1. I times I equals -1. And -1 times -1 is a positive 1. So I to the different powers can give us 4 different answers. We can have I, we can have -1, we can have negative I, or positive 1. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at simplifying. So here we've got the square root of -25. We want to break this down, so we're going to take the -25 and break it into factors of -25. So the square root of 25 multiplied by the square root of -1. And we know what the square root of 25 is. That's just 5. The square root of -1, we just defined it. We said that equals I. So we're saying the square root of -25 is equal to 5I. Okay, we're going to do the same thing with -9. Again, break it into factors. So we break the -1 out, and then we have the square root of 9 multiplied by the square root of -1. Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of -1 is I. So the square root of -9 is equal to 3I. Here we've got 2 different square roots and we want to add them together. Before we can do this, we have to simplify both. So the square root of -4 we break into the square root of 4 multiplied by the square root of -1, which is, oops, there goes the lead. So square root of 4 is 2, square root of -1 is I, and we do the same thing with the 16. So square root of 16 times the square root of -1, that equals 4 times I. So 2I plus 4I, we treat the i's kind of like we do with our x's. 2I plus 4I is 6I. And that's our answer. Okay, here we need to multiply. So again, find our factors. So the 49, square root of -49 is the square root of 49 multiplied by the square root of -1. The square root of -25 is the square root of positive 25 multiplied by the square root of -1. Square root of 49 is 7. Square root of -1 is I. So we have 7I multiplied by square root of 25 is 5, and square root of -1 is I. So now we multiply these guys together. The 7 times the 5 is 35. I times I is I squared, just like with x's. However, the difference here is when we've got this I squared, we already defined, is equal to -1. So we're going to replace this. So instead of 35 times I squared, it's 35 multiplied by -1, which is -35. So our answer is negative 35. Okay, so let's take a look at these. A complex number. So we've had real numbers, we've had whole numbers. This is the first time you're hearing about complex numbers. Complex numbers have this form of a plus bi. A is a real number, b is a real number, and I is the square root of negative 1. It's the imaginary part. So we always try and write the real part first, then plus the imaginary part. When we go to add these together, we add the real part with the real part, the imaginary with the imaginary. So 5 plus 9 gives us 14. Negative 3i plus a 2i gives us a negative 1i. And you don't have to write the 1. It's perfectly okay to write as 14 minus I. That's just as good. And you don't tend to mix it up. So the answer to that is just 14 minus I. Here we're subtracting. And just like we did in the last class, when you have a polynomial, you subtract the real parts. So 9 minus 2 gives you 7. 7i minus 4i is 3i. So your answer is simply 7 plus 3i. Let's try another one of those. So we have 4 minus 3i minus I plus 1. So the real with the real. So 4 minus 1 is 3. Negative 3i minus I is negative 4i. And that's your answer. Nothing else to do on that. Okay, let's come down here where we're going to do some multiplication. 6i times 9i. 6 times 9 is 54. I times I is I squared. Remember what we said at the beginning. I squared is the same as negative 1. So we're going to replace the I squared with negative 1. 54 times negative 1 is negative 54. And that's my answer. Okay. What happens when we start with a negative in our problem? Nothing's different here. So negative 3 times 5 is negative 15. I times I is I squared. You don't need to put these parentheses. I'm not sure why I did that. But I squared, we're going to replace with negative 1. Negative 15 times negative 1. Remember, two negatives multiplied give you a positive, so that's positive 15. Again, that's your answer. Ooh, multiplication where we have to distribute here. We're going to distribute the negative 2 to the 7 and to the 6i. So negative 2 times 7 is negative 14. Negative 2 times 6i is a negative 12i. Done with the problem. That's straightforward. Okay, let's come down to the last row. Here we've got 2i times 7 plus 3i. And here we're going to distribute the 2i to both terms. So 2i times 7 gives us 14i. 2i times 3i gives us 2 times 3 is 6. I times I is I squared. Now remember, we can't leave an I squared in here. We've got to replace it with negative 1. So we're going to have 14i plus 6 times a negative 1. So we'll rewrite this as 14i. 6 times negative 1 is negative 6. And typically we like to write the real part first. So we're going to put the negative 6 plus 14i. And again, that's just proper form. It's not wrong to have it as 14i minus 6. It's just better form to list the real number first. Okay. Ooh, this is very similar to binomial times a binomial. So the way we're going to handle this is either by FOIL or box. I'm going to go ahead and let's do the box on this guy. We draw our box. We've got negative 3 and a positive 6i. Let's make sure that's an I. Multiplied by a negative 3 times plus 4i. So that left times the top. Negative 3 times negative 3 is a positive 9. Negative 3 times 4i is a negative 12i. 6i times negative 3 gives me a negative 18i. And finally, 6 times 4 is 24. I times I is I squared. What did we say about I squared? We can't leave that there. We've got to replace it with negative 1. So all that does is change the sign. So this one is really equal to a negative 24. And we cross that out so we remember which part we're dealing with here. And now we write our answer by adding the real parts together and the imaginary parts together. So we've got a 9 minus a 24. 9 minus 24 is a negative 15. And negative 18i plus, remember this is a plus right here, negative 18i plus a negative 12i gives us a negative 30i. That is the answer to multiplying those two different complex numbers. Okay, our final one, 3 plus 2i squared. So we need to do either our box or FOIL again. So I'm going to go ahead and do the box. So we've got 3 plus 2i multiplied by 3 plus 2i. Top times the left gives us 9. 3 times 2i is 6i. 2i times 3 is 6i. And 2i times 2i is 4i squared, which again is equal to negative 4. Because all the I squared does is change the sign. So we put our answer together by adding together the real parts. So 9 plus a negative 4 is 5. 6i plus 6i is 12i. So our answer to this one is 5 plus 12i. Okay, hopefully this helps.